The first thing that we need to think about is that we need to take time to think. One of the most important things that a professor told me one time was you should take an hour every day here and just sit and think. The part of that was missing, however, was I wasn't thinking about what I was thinking about enough. So I started to think about that before I even started to think. And when we start talking more about critical thinking, that's what's going to kind of take us a little bit deeper into what's important about being a teacher, especially a teacher at this day and age, when we need to redefine teachers and who teachers are, what teachers need to be doing, and so on and so forth. Human beings aren't mechanical clocks. We don't just tick and tick and tick and tick, recognizing that a flawed clock will stop telling time, right? A flawed human being won't ever stop being a flawed human being. So we have to think about this notion that all human beings are flawed, right? We all make mistakes. We all have chances to reflect. We all have chances to correct the mistakes that we make. We're not mechanical instruments. We all change over time. We change from day to day. Elements of us change after everything we hear. We develop. We're constantly learning and taking in new perspectives as we walk through this kind of path of life. Educators, I ask you, do we lack the vision or do we just lack perspective? It's an interesting contrast when you think about it. Do we lack vision or do we lack perspective? Because the education system right now has kind of gotten away from what education was meant to be. Education was meant to be the mechanism to perpetuate one of three things. It was meant to be an instrument to learn about your culture and your civic society around you. And that's actually a fairly basic realm of education. Number two, it was meant to teach us about becoming better citizens, more socially, more intellectually, more academically inclined. It was supposed to help us think. Leaders come from being educated at some particular point in time. Thirdly, it was about getting us smart enough to make more money. And initially, they kind of went in that order. But lately, if you look around our education system, they don't fall in that order anymore. In fact, we've kind of moved to a society in a capitalist country that's driven exclusively by the gain of capital to making the drive for money the first priority. And as we look around universities all over the country, including this one, that's why we have a brand new business building over here. The second priority now is kind of a civics, but it's a very, very tainted civics because we only learn one perspective of history. So civically, throughout the course of this country, we've been trained, not taught, where we live, how we live, what we live with, and on and on and on, from a very, very specific point of view. That point of view is very, very important for the perpetuation of this country, because if we start to veer off that view, we're simply going to implode. Because when the truth comes out, it's not so pleasant. Our education system has taught us the perspective of only the pleasant. For instance, when we were taught about the Declaration of Independence in the K-12 system, we were taught very specifically about the wonders of the Declaration of Independence, how it's this greatest document of all time, and on and on and on and on. What was never talked about and has never been talked about since in the K-12 system is really how it's failed so many people. And it is a marvelous document, right? But we only got one perspective, and we're only taught one perspective. And this is continuously solidified, as I've said, by this notion of having to say the Pledge of Allegiance every day in school. We're pledging allegiance every day in some schools. Not as many as we used to. by getting vast amount of people gathered in huge stadiums, sometimes 70, 80,000, sometimes 100,000 if you go to Michigan State, and singing the national anthem, right? We're perpetuating this notion of nationality to try to keep some coherence in a society that's very, very chaotic. And if you study the notions of capitalism, it gets more and more chaotic as we go because it's completely and totally based off the notions of competition. Whenever you have competition, you're putting one person, one idea, one element, one something against another. And you're trying to outdo them. Does that create friendship? I did a lecture one time where somebody out of the audience, out of nowhere, asked me about the Middle East because we were talking about conflict. And this was the time when we went into Iraq as a country. And I said, I think the greatest way to create peace is to not create so many enemies. Right? When you go in and invade countries, what are you creating? Peace or enemies? I mean, it seems logical to me. But for some reason, we as a country are not there. And most societies around the world aren't there. True education solves problems before they occur. So there are certain things that have happened throughout this country that have been the direct descendant of very, very bad political decisions that we're not allowed to teach. But what we don't understand is that everything in this country and everything around the world is based on the notions of compromise of people, which is politics. It's like talking about the Middle East and not talking about religion. You can't solve problems in the Middle East until you start talking about religion. Because everything over there is based on religion. And, you know, last semester somebody commented that Gary doesn't like this and you shouldn't be talking about religion. Is it better to educate people to eat better and prevent them from having heart problems when they're older than to give them an artificial heart down the road? Well, it's certainly a lot less expensive. Is it better to educate people about stress rather than give them surgery for gallstones down the road and stomach replacements and all the other stuff that we spend so much money developing scientifically? I think if we were to take those energies of science and channel them to something probably more productive, not that health isn't productive, and I've had my gallbladder taken out and I'm thankful for it, right? Because we're already to a point where we decided it's better to fix things after they happen than to prevent them before they happen. That's the key. That's where education has failed. If we're properly educating on all realms of social issues, we would be preventing rather than fixing. Do we, in South Dakota, choose to spend money on jails, or do we spend money on programs that prevent people from going to jail? In South Dakota, we spend money on jails. Teachers change the way we think. Get us back to solving problems before they happen rather than figuring out ways to fix them after they happen. Your job as teachers in a classroom is to recognize problems that a student might be having, to fix those problems so the entire year isn't a waste and a wash for that particular student. It's vitally important that you get to the bottom of students. You have a student come into class crying, you know there might be something going on at home, you need to fix that issue. That's part of a teacher's moral responsibility. And it goes across the board. But we're being torn from that in the teacher profession. Educators can bridge that gap between those that think progress is money and those that think there's more than money in the notion of life. Part of our job as educators are not only to teach people to have a good life in terms of being able to afford to pay rent, but it's also about the other two aspects, the civic responsibility and your own social responsibility. Becoming intelligent people, socially intelligent, intellectually intelligent. It's tough to pull the mind of the youth from the notion of this Band-Aid thinking, and that's all we've been taught through the K-12 system. Put a Band-Aid on it, we'll worry about it later. In the meantime, it just keeps piling up and piling up and piling up and piling up. One of the important things that has happened in my life is my dad's funeral. My dad's funeral was a life-changing event for me. I was in Minnesota, and my dad lived in Enfield, Connecticut. I got a call that he went into the hospital. I just got a chill because I knew he'd suffered from emphysema his entire life. I have emphysema that runs on both sides of my family. So I'm very, very careful about being around cigarette smoke and all that kind of thing. And always have been. I was one of the kids that, you go ahead and smoke yourself. I don't really want to get into that stuff. Luckily. I get out there after he dies, and I'm walking into the funeral parlor where the wake is. And I stop. I have my daughter Margaret was with me. I looked up to make sure I was going into the right door, and there was my name. I'm a junior. Actually, I should be the fourth, but they named my grandfather Herbert. So you're going to hear a lot of stories about Herbert and my dad. They were quite the characters. Very typical Indians. So I'm looking over the door, and there's my name, first, middle, and last. And you want to talk about a cold chill? Walk into a wake sometime, look over the door, and see your own name. Holy crap. So I walk in, and you know, wakes aren't for the dead, they're for the humans. Funerals aren't for the dead, they're for the humans. They're a way to try to find some kind of closure on an episode in your life that's so traumatic that you can't fathom living without it. So you walk in, and you go through all the motions, and you're hugging everybody, and all the words are the same. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, and it's, you know, on and on and on, and that's all okay. That's great. I think it's one of the best ceremonies you can have. Indian people, we're going to talk about the Indian ceremony of sending people over down the road. But we all have different ways of grieving, and that's perfectly viable. If you want to go, you can go. If you don't, you don't have to go, right? You send flowers. So the funeral, or the wake's over, the funeral begins. It's very small. They didn't want to make a big deal over it, so we go out to the graveyard in Elberg, Vermont. That's where he got buried. And I'm walking through the graveyard. I'm trying to find, you know, the section where my family is. I'm looking around, and bam, there's my exact name again. I'm supposed to be the fourth. I'm thinking, God, I don't even know anything about this person. That's my name. I walk a little bit further. There it is again. My great-great-great-grandfather with my name. First, middle, and last. I know nothing about it. Nothing. I knew his name. That's about it. Think about this and answer correctly and honestly. How many people in here know the name of their great-great-great-grandfather? Great-great-grandfather. Great-grandfather. Yeah. Is that the way that your great-great-grandfather would have wanted it? Think back. Right now, you're sitting in this classroom. There's a chance you might have great-great-grandchildren. What if they're in this classroom and they're asked that question and they can't answer it either? Is that the way that you want it? Holy crap. Are you just going to wind up being a headstone in a corner of the cemetery that nobody will ever remember? Or are you going to be somebody who makes a difference? Somebody that somebody remembers. Genealogy is real popular nowadays. You know, there's internet things all over the place. By the way, one of the biggest and best genealogy online systems comes from the Mormon. look back, when you hit 50, you get kind of reflective. And when I hit 50, I got reflective. I started to think about all kinds of stuff, as you do when you start growing older. I wasn't going through a midlife crisis, but I was getting kind of reflective. I'm wondering, what is life about? You know, I'm way past the halfway mark. And what have I done that's meaningful to anybody? What have I done? You could argue that, yeah, Gary, you made a difference in some classrooms and all that other kind of stuff. And that's okay. But I don't consider a lot of what I've done all that meaningful. I have lots of regrets. You have regrets already. All of you do. About opportunities you've had, about choices that you've had, about ways that you've been thinking, about all kinds of stuff. One of the things I do when I talk to Indian youth on the reservations is try to pound that home a little bit. Do you want to live a life of complete regret, or do you want to do something? It's vitally important that one day you sit down during that hour a day of thinking and think about kind of who you are and what you want to do. Do you want to just walk through life and wind up buried under some cold, gray stone in the corner of a graveyard where nobody's ever going to remember you? Or do you want to make a difference? As teachers, you have a greater opportunity than anybody else. You have a marvelous opportunity. As we work our way through this very, very short page in the whole book of time, what is going to be written on that page about you? One of the most gratifying things that's ever happened to me happened to a teacher that I had. When I went into 7th grade, I was reading at a 2nd grade level. 2nd grade level. Teacher's name was Mr. Leary. I still call him Mr. Leary. Right? Taught me how to read. When I left that class, I was reading at a 13.5 level. And it didn't take much. All somebody needed to do was say, Gary, sit down and read. Right? So Gary sat down and started reading. And it happened that quick. 1/4. I never would have accomplished anything without that, believe me. Because I really didn't even have an interest. Why read when you can see the movie, right? Years later, as I was going through my first degree, which was in marketing, in which I learned a lot about the capitalist system, more than I wanted to know. I'm driving cab at night to help make a little extra money. And I picked up another teacher that I had who taught with Mr. Lair at the same time that I went through 7th grade. And for some reason he recognized me. In fact, he said I hadn't changed much, which means I was a really homely kid or I was just unforgettable. So I told him kind of this story. He says, you're not going to believe this, but tomorrow night, I'm bowling with him. And I went, what? This was a Wednesday. He says, yeah, we have a bowling league every Thursday night. He's on our bowling team. And he looked at me and he says, you know something, Gary? I'll bet you he'd love to hear from you. I thought, geez, what a great opportunity. So the next night, happens I was working again, and I signed my cab out and I drove out to bowling alley. I walked in and I looked around and I recognized him immediately. He looked the same except he was old and gray. So I walked up to him and the other teacher, his name was Mr. Keller, was sitting right next to him, looked up and smiled at me, right? And he kind of pointed and I said, so I tapped him on the shoulder, I tapped Mr. Lerin on the shoulder and I said, I had you as a teacher, do you remember me? He didn't. But you're going to recognize why. Right? It's not the success told students that you're going to remember most as a teacher. It's the troubled ones. So I was thinking about that, and I said, you know something? I was in a class with Pete Henneman. Pete Henneman was really bad. He was a bad kid. I don't know where he is today. I hope that he's changed. And then he kind of thought maybe he might have remembered me a little bit, right? Even though Mr. Keller remembered me just like that. I told him that story. How thankful I was because I was in college, I had some perspective, I was a reader, I had some other things done that we're going to talk about in other stories. I mean, there's a lot of series of success beyond all odds of being an Indian male in this society, right? So, I'm telling him the story, and I looked down at him, tear. And I know, he said to me, he said, Mr. Cheeseman, didn't call me dear. He said, Mr. Cheeseman, you see what he did there? He elevated me. He said, Mr. Cheeseman, this is the first time anybody's ever come back and told me a story like that. Well, guess what happens to Gary? Like, wow. We all have teachers in here who've made a difference. Everybody in here is a teacher to remember. Whose was yours? Yeah, whose was yours? Whose was yours?
Mrs. Helmer.
Yep. And just like that, wrap out the names. He never even knew. He never even knew the effect he had on him. He could have lived his entire life and not known that. I was the first. You gotta be kidding. One of the most gratifying things I get now is especially teachers who are out 5 years, I still get people who come back and say, oh, this is a bad thing about the education. So they say, yours is the only class I remember in the education program. So you gotta be kidding me, right? That's tragic. And I'm not bragging when I say that. It's the opposite. It's how bad our profession has become. I was so happy that I got the opportunity to say that at that point in time. If you come from Indian culture, one of the beliefs, and I know this is kind of passé for a lot of people, but in our culture, we really believe that everything happens for a reason. Everything does. I believe that education is much different today. I do my classes not for the sake of issuing you your grade that you desperately want, right? That's why you're in here. That and they make you come. But for me, it's not about that. For me, it's about hoping that somehow, some way, by the time this course is over, you're going to take something with you of value. That's pretty much what I care about. If you get a good grade in the process, like most of you will, so be it. As you're going to find out, the transparency of this class is going to probably give you as much insight into your teaching and the profession that you want to get into as anything else. Legacy. What legacy are you going to leave? Why has your path crossed as mine? That's a very, very common Indian question. Why has your path crossed with mine? Why did you end up at the University of South Dakota instead of the evil empire up the road? Or any other university around the nation? Why, in my life that went just like this, did I end up here? Right here, right now. Your life that went, it's been a lot shorter, went like this, has ended up right here, right now, for some reason. And I don't believe that that reason is solely because you were made to be in this class. I believe that it happened a long time ago. I believe it happened when you first decided you were going to be a teacher. If thinking in terms of an Indian perspective, that decision set something into motion.
This led you right here, right now, to hear this mumbo jumbo. See, we're not even talking about Indian stuff yet. You've already got tremendous insight into some Indian thought. That's the way this goes. Pedagogy is the content, the content's the pedagogy. So, you have to start asking yourself who you are, what you want to be. You have to come to terms with the fact that you have one shot at it. Just one. You only live once. What is your destiny? What is your life going to be? As we move through the course, we're going to be reflecting back on this quite a few times. What is your legacy going to be? Folks, you start right here, right now. Now is the time to start thinking about that. Now is the time to start thinking about how and where you fit. What are you going to become? Super teachers. We all have the potential to be great. Extraordinary.
I don't have a question, but I kind of got a comment. When I was at SCSU, I took a class by, I don't remember his name right now, but he kind of talked about the same thing he was talking about. But he said, like, in the world, like, it was basically the same thing, but he was saying that in this world, everything we have, like, everyone kind of cares about materialistic things and like their physical appearances and stuff, but then like after we leave this world, we're not going to have anything. The only thing we'll have left in this world is your name. And so he talks about like making a name for yourself and stuff. So just like how everything, our bodies and all the stuff we own, just going to turn back to dirt, dust. And then he was asking like, why do we care so much about these things if they don't